You know David as the great king who defeated giants and brought glory to Israel. But what no one tells you is that this same king, so brave in battle, remained silent when his own daughter, Tamar, faced one of the most cowardly and violent acts of her life. What you're about to discover isn't in the victory songs, but in the shadows of the palace where the true battles were fought. Why would a man who faced armies hesitate in the face of an injustice within his own home? And how did that silence unleash a revenge that would forever change the course of his family? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you will understand why this story is the most impactful and overlooked one in the 2 Samuel. Get ready to be surprised and uncover the untold side of the king you thought you knew. At the height of his reign, David was recognized not only as a warrior king, but as the archetype of the leader chosen by God, a man after God's own heart. His name was framed by stories of glory, from his youth, when he faced the giant Goliath with just a sling and a stone, to the days he led his army with a firm hand and a brave heart. Jerusalem, the city he conquered, thrived under his leadership. The Ark of the Covenant rested there, symbolizing the closeness between God and Israel, and the streets were filled with songs celebrating David's justice and divine protection over the kingdom. Everything seemed to suggest that the king was unbeatable, both on the battlefield and in governance. However, behind the doors of the royal chambers, David's life was full of subtler yet equally dangerous challenges. His children, born of different wives and raised with varying expectations, grew up in an environment where competition and conflicting interests were ever present. Among them, Amnon, the firstborn, and Absalom, restless and protective, stood out. And Tamar, Absalom's sister and Amnon's half-sister, shone with an innocence that captivated everyone around her. Tamar's beauty and gentle nature made her a beloved figure, but they also put her in a position of vulnerability in a home where ambitions and desires could turn dangerous. David watched all this with eyes that mixed pride and unease. As a father, he sought to maintain order and protect his children, but his attention was constantly divided between the duties of a king and the needs of his family. Within the palace walls, whispers of jealousy and rivalry were common, and in silence, David saw tensions rise. His inaction, perhaps motivated by the hope that things would resolve on their own, became a risky choice. Each day of inaction was a gamble that accumulated, and the scales began to tip dangerously toward an outcome even the wisest king seemed unable to foresee. David's paradox became increasingly evident. A king who spoke eloquently about justice and had written hymns about righteousness, yet seemed hesitant to impose the same justice within his own home with the same firm voice. This hesitation did not go unnoticed, especially by those who had their own desires and grievances. Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom moved through the palace halls like actors in a play whose roles were not yet fully defined. David's silence, which could be interpreted as prudence or omission, began to cast shadows that would inevitably spread. Then, the question echoes in the hearts of those who observed this story. How could a king so great, who faced armies and fiercely defended his people, stay silent in the face of a situation that required his voice? How could a man who faced Saul's wrath, sought refuge in the mountains, and survived deserts accept such a terrible and cowardly act without raising his hand in response? This contradiction between David's public greatness and his apparent passivity in certain situations creates a dark prelude. The weight of his silence and how it would resonate throughout the royal family would soon be revealed, leaving a legacy that would forever tarnish David's name. Amnon, David's firstborn, grew up surrounded by the privileges that came with the title of heir. Amidst the luxury of the palace, he was watched with special attention. After all, the weight of continuing David's legacy rested on him. However, what went on inside him was far different from the public image he displayed. The obsession that began to consume his mind was directed at Tamar, his half-sister, whose beauty and kindness made her cherished by all. Amnon's desire was not merely a passing admiration, but an insane passion that grew like a shadow, increasingly dense and suffocating. Tamar, with her innocence and kindness, was unaware of the looks Amnon gave her. She continued her tasks in the palace, tending to her duties with the same diligence as always, never suspecting the storm that was approaching. Tamar's name meant palm tree, and indeed, She was a silent pillar of strength and elegance amidst the turbulence that characterized the royal family. But her presence, which should have been a source of protection and affection, became the focus of her brother's obsession, which he could not control. The tension within the family relationships grew invisibly, and each encounter between them carried a weight that only Amnon understood. Jonadab, Amnon's cousin known for his cunning, was someone who could read others' intentions like no one else. Noticing Amnon's distress, he approached and, in a tone that mixed curiosity and persuasion, asked, "Why are you, the king's son, looking so haggard day after day?" It was then that Jonadab, with his shrewd mind, proposed a plan that would forever change David's family's fate. He suggested that Amnon pretend to be ill and ask for Tamar to come serve him, an act that, to everyone, would appear harmless and even compassionate. It was advice that combined deception and opportunity, crafted by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate circumstances. Amnon, without hesitation, followed Jonadab's advice. He pretended to be bedridden, and when David came to visit him, he made the request for Tamar to be sent to his room with the intention of preparing food before him. David, unaware of his son's hidden motives, agreed, thinking it a reasonable request for someone seemingly unwell. Thus, Tamar was called, and with the same kindness and care she always showed, she complied with her brother's request. In her mind, helping a sick brother was simply a reflection of her compassionate nature, without suspecting that the plan devised by Jonadab would bring tragic consequences for her and the entire house of David. Amnon's mind burned with anticipation. What was an innocent visit for Tamar was for him the moment to satisfy his consuming desire. As she prepared the food, the air seemed to grow denser, laden with a foreboding that would only reveal itself too late. Jonadab's influence had transformed what could have been a mere unrequited passion into a fatal trap. Tamar, unsuspecting, entered her brother's quarters with a bowl of fresh dough, ready to serve him and offer some comfort in his supposed sickness. The scene, which could have been a simple gesture of family care, quickly turned dark. The sweetness that filled the air gave way to suffocating tension. Amnon, heart pounding and eyes fixed on Tamar, waited for the moment he could act on his desire. The silence in that room, which initially seemed innocent, became a prelude to betrayal. When Tamar approached to feed Amnon, he grabbed her forcefully, revealing his true intentions. Tamar, surprised and terrified, tried to reason with him, pleading for the honor of David's house and begging him to consider the consequences of such a terrible act. "No, my brother, do not force me. Such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not commit this folly," she implored, as the situation unfolded before her eyes with a cruelty she had never imagined. But Tamar's words, which should have awakened Amnon's conscience, were lost in the fever of his obsession. In that moment, any semblance of love or respect vanished. Tamar's innocence was irreparably shattered when Amnon committed the heinous act that would change everyone's lives in the palace. The betrayal was complete, and with it came an immediate shift in Amnon's heart. What had once been insatiable desire turned into fierce disdain. "Get up and leave," he ordered, rejecting Tamar with cold indifference. For her, the physical pain was quickly overshadowed by the emotional torment and the despair of being treated with such contempt. She begged not to be expelled, as the shame of being abandoned in that state would be greater than the act itself. However, Amnon did not care for her suffering and sent her away, locking the door behind her. Tamar, with her dress torn and ashes on her head, left Amnon's chambers crying and wailing. She who once embodied purity and joy now walked the palace halls like a specter of pain and humiliation. The servants who saw her could not help but feel the weight of what had happened, but the royal palace, with all its luxury, seemed to maintain a complicit silence. Absalom, who heard his sister's cries and saw her condition, immediately took her into his home. "Be calm, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart," he said, trying to soothe Tamar, though the fire of anger began to burn in his heart. David, who had so often been a model of courage and leadership, now faced a situation that paralyzed even the most seasoned king. Upon learning what had happened to Tamar, his beloved daughter, rage filled his heart. But surprisingly, this fury did not translate into action. The king, who had challenged giants and defeated mighty enemies, remained silent in the face of the tragedy involving his own children. David's lack of response created a void that echoed through every corner of the palace. The justice he had once championed seemed buried under an invisible burden, and the consequences of this omission would prove fatal. David's silence, which some might interpret as caution, was in fact a hesitation with a high cost. Amnon, the perpetrator, continued to live under the protection of the palace, unpunished. Tamar, dishonored and abandoned, became a constant reminder of David's failure to act. Absalom, meanwhile, absorbed this omission with a tense calm. He cared for his sister, offering her shelter and comfort, but his mind worked incessantly toward justice. Absalom's anger was like a hidden ember, waiting only for the right moment to blaze into a flame. David's decisions, or rather, the lack thereof, sent a clear message to everyone around him. The kingdom watched in silence, realizing that the king who proclaimed justice in public squares and on battlefields refused to apply it in his own house. Servants whispered, and advisors averted their gaze when passing by Tamar. Knowing that the absence of justice was a stain that could not be ignored, David's silence became a burden that weighed not just on him, but on the entire royal family. This void fed Absalom's growing unrest, who saw each day without an answer as another reason to take justice into his own hands. David, even as a father, found himself trapped in a dilemma that extended beyond his role as king. Why didn't he act? Was it the weight of paternal love that stopped him from punishing Amnon, or was it the fear of provoking even more disunity among his children? The truth is, his inaction did not calm the waters. On the contrary, it stirred them into a silent whirlwind. This void fed Absalom's growing unrest, who saw each day without an answer as another reason to take justice into his own hands. 2 years passed since the terrible act that marked Tamar and disgraced David's household. The apparent calm in Jerusalem's palace concealed a tension that grew subtly but relentlessly. Absalom, Tamar's brother, maintained silence during this time, a silence that masked the fury burning within him. He waited, and what seemed to be passivity was, in fact, a meticulous plan to restore his sister's honor and, at the same time, challenge his father David's inaction. The moment to act was approaching, and Absalom knew that his vengeance needed to be executed with precision. Those 2 years were not a period of inertia for Absalom. He used them to observe and prepare. Each day without justice was another stone in the construction of what would become an act of calculated retribution. The palace, with its walls that witnessed whispers and exchanged glances, was a stage for silent expectation. Amnon, the guilty one who went on with his life without fear of retribution, did not see the shadow growing around him. The brother watching him seemed calm, but in his mind justice, denied by David, was a personal commitment he would not fail to fulfill. Absalom, discreet in his preparations, began planning an event that would draw everyone's attention. A great banquet at Baal Hazor, a remote location suitable for what he intended. He sent invitations, gathering all of David's sons and other court nobles under the pretext of celebrating the shearing, a common and festive practice. The invitation, carefully crafted, left no room for suspicion, and Amnon himself, carefree and confident in the absence of any action against him, accepted to attend. Absalom's plot was nearly complete, and the stage for his revenge was set. When the day of the banquet arrived, the atmosphere of joy and relaxation masked Absalom's true intentions. The gathered brothers, laughing and drinking, had no idea that the night would end in bloodshed. Absalom, watching every detail, remained calm while his servants, previously instructed, waited only for the signal to act. The exact moment was essential, and Absalom, a master of his own patience, knew that a well-timed order would make the strike decisive and undeniable. The banquet at Baal Hazor, initially filled with laughter and celebration, quickly turned into a scene of horror. Absalom gave the order for his servants to strike down Amnon. The air, once warm with festivity, became heavy with oppressive silence, interrupted only by the sound of the blade finding its mark. Amnon, caught by surprise, had his final moment marked by terror etched across his face. Blood spread across the stone floor, staining the night with a cruel red, and the sound of it running echoed like a fatal sentence against the hall's walls. The guests' eyes widened in terror. Panic spread like wildfire, turning what had been a family celebration into a living nightmare. Cries of fear and despair mixed with the hurried footsteps of brothers trying to flee for their lives. Amnon's lifeless body lay there, his expression frozen in a blend of shock and horror, a sight that would haunt those who witnessed it. Absalom's revenge was not just an act of personal justice, but a message loaded with darkness and defiance, written in blood for all to see. In Jerusalem, David was overcome with searing anguish upon hearing the initial, exaggerated reports claiming that all his sons had been killed. Despair seized the king, striking him with the force of an invisible blade. Jonadab, the advisor who had planted the seed of deceit in Amnon, stepped forward to inform him that only Amnon had been killed by Absalom's order. David's grief was not only for the loss of his firstborn, but for the realization that his household was crumbling under the weight of his own omissions. The blood of Amnon, spilled that night, stained not just the ground, but David's very soul and the memory of the kingdom. Absalom's flight to Geshur following the execution was like the shadow cast by an impending storm. The brother who avenged Tamar with blood-stained hands now went into exile, but his act continued to haunt the palace corridors. The silence that reigned after Amnon's death was suffocating, as if justice itself had been corrupted by hatred. David, consumed by grief, found himself powerless, unable to stop the unfolding consequences of the crime and the vengeance that followed. The echo of the blade and the spilled blood became symbols of what was to come, a silent rebellion that would unfold like a dark tide. The night at Baal Hazor was not forgotten. The blood shed and the screams that accompanied it laid the foundation for a cycle of destruction and distrust. David knew that Absalom's act was more than revenge. It was a challenge to his leadership, an assertion that the justice he had neglected would be taken by others, even if it meant tearing at the heart of the family. The silence that once surrounded the palace had now become a threatening presence, foretelling that David's reign would face even more shadows and that Amnon's death was only the beginning of a dark era. Tamar, already devastated by the assault she had suffered, now carried not only her own pain, but the worsening family tragedy. The silence that had once permeated the palace was now a constant reminder of David's omission. The justice he did not administer personally had turned into a vengeance that tore at the fabric of his family, leaving wounds that would not soon heal. David's household, once seen as an example of glory and power, became a display of emotional and familial ruins. Tamar lived under Absalom's care, but what surrounded her was an environment of mourning and silent revolt. David, consumed by guilt and grief, saw his children's faces and knew that his past inaction had now manifested as a division threatening to tear apart both his family and his kingdom. His attempts to protect and maintain internal peace had proven to be a fatal mistake. The absence of dialogue and action had become the catalyst for a spiral of destruction engulfing everyone around him. While Absalom remained in exile in Geshur, far from his father's reach, the tension in Jerusalem did not lessen. Absalom's figure, even in absence, was a constant reminder of the price of injustice. The palace corridors, which once echoed with the songs and psalms composed by David, now held an uncomfortable silence, heavy with the memory of an unpunished crime. Every advisor and servant knew that peace was just an illusion, and Absalom's return would bring the storm they all feared. Tamar, for her part, remained silent, a living shadow of a wound that would never heal. David's family narrative was marked by a series of events that proved how silence can be both a shield and a curse. The consequences of not acting and not listening to the cries and sufferings of his own children taught David a bitter lesson. The king, who so often sought God's guidance in his psalms, now faced the disorder that his own inaction had sown. Tamar's emotional scars, Amnon's blood and Absalom's exile, were symbols that the absence of justice and action do not result in peace, but in vengeance and pain. Over time, Absalom's return to the family circle was inevitable. But he did not return as an obedient son or a loyal subject. The absence of justice and David's omission had fueled a resentment that now grew like a tree rooted in dark soil. The silence that marked each interaction between father and son spoke louder than any open confrontation. The tension was palpable, like a string about to snap. David, who had so desired to avoid an internal war, found himself on the brink of a conflict that his own silence had created. The tragedy of Tamar and Absalom's revenge left painful lessons, not just for David, but for anyone who looked closely. The kingdom he had worked so hard to strengthen was now threatened by its own internal failures. The leadership that had avoided confrontations to preserve peace ended up losing control over the most precious family bonds. Thus, Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom's story was not just a tale of pain, but a warning about the danger of ignoring family problems and letting silence be the only advisor in times of injustice. The story of Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom is a powerful reminder of the price paid for silence and omission in the face of injustice. David, with all his greatness and achievements, saw his family shatter not from external forces, but from decisions he failed to make. And now I ask you, how many times have you avoided confronting a problem, hoping it would resolve itself? What are the consequences of ignoring the signs of conflict in your own home, workplace, or personal life? This story is a warning. Acting in the face of injustice is not just a choice, it is a necessity to protect what we hold most dear. So what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let silence speak for you, or will you take control of your own story? If you find these lessons as impactful as I do, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, to keep learning about the lesser-told truths of the Bible and their powerful lessons, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Don't let the next lesson pass you by.